Okay, so I'm going to be starting with the essay part 2 using the Wiggers diagram to explain depolarization, muscle contraction, and pressure changes. So let's go to the Wiggers diagram. So this is it. This is the Spanish version. It's fine. So this wave we have pressure of the ventricles. This wave is the pressure of the atriums, and this wave, the top gray one, is the pressure of the aorta. Down here we have the electrical signaling. This represents depolarization, and here is just value. So from this we get our three things we're talking about. We have the depolarization, pressure, and finally we have muscle contraction. Okay, so I went through and I went ahead and drew it out. So all of these three things relate to each other. So if we have a high pressure, we're going to need a strong muscle contraction to be able to overwhelm that high pressure and be able to push blood out of into the aorta. Because the high pressure acts as a closing force on the aortic valve, preventing it from opening. So we need to punch through that to actually get blood out of the heart, into the aorta, into the rest of the body. So in order to have that strong muscle contraction, we need a strong depolarization, because the depolarization is what signals the muscle contraction. Finally, if we have, as I mentioned before, a high pressure, we're going to need a strong depolarization, again for that same reason. And then that also goes into if we have, let's say, a low amount of depolarization. Low amount of depolarization is going to lead to weaker muscle contractions and less often muscle contractions. That leads to a lower pressure. So all of these things are just a triangle of cause and effect. However, there can be certain things that affect these triangles outside, certain factors that affect the triangle that are outside of the triangle. For instance, atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a blockage in the blood vessels, which prevents blood from going through them at the same rate. So, to go past this blood blockage, typically what is done is there's an increase in pressure, blood pressure. I don't know if I said this. This is blood pressure. By having an increase in blood pressure, or having an increase in muscle contraction required to generate that increase in blood pressure. And that increase in muscle contraction requires an increase in depolarization. So going back to the diagram, this is what it would look like. So this starting pressure would be needs to be higher, as well as this ventricular pressure would need to be higher. So to push this pressure into the higher parts of the spectrum, we would have to increase either the frequency of these waves and or increase the magnitude of them by having stronger contractions. Having stronger depolarizations, we would have stronger contractions, which gives us that greater pressure that we need. Now, the other thing we can do to affect this triangle really easily, that is not a condition but like a pharmacological way, is through drugs. There's a lot of different drugs that affect each part of this cycle. For instance, we can have muscle relaxants that relax the muscles, make it more difficult for them to have stronger contractions. And because of that, they're going to have weaker contractions. That causes a decrease in pressure without necessarily a big increase in depolarization. We can also have inotropes or adrenogenic agonists, which are going to increase muscle contraction by increasing the force at which they contract. There's a couple different modalities that they can do this. They can increase the amount of calcium going into the muscle cell, which increases force of contraction. They can increase the rate at which it's being pumped out. They can increase the affinity of troponin C. But all of these ways would have an effect on muscle contraction, causing it to be stronger, which would increase pressure, while not necessarily have a major increase on depolarization. However, we can have other ways to affect depolarization, such as beta blockers and other medications that slow the rate, R-A-T-E, of depolarizations or slow the severity of them. Decrease the magnitude of those depolarizations. Also, you have drugs that affect pressure. There's a lot of different drugs that affect pressure, and of course, one way we can affect pressure is by either affecting muscle contractions or affecting depolarizations. So it's basically all of these two drugs would also affect this. But we also have some of its own drugs, like vasodilators, diuretics, or vasopressors. So what vasodilators would do is they would open up the blood vessels, and because the blood vessels are open, blood flows more easily, and that decreases blood pressure. We also have, as I said, vasopressors, which do the exact opposite thing, where they constrict the blood vessels, and that increases the pressure of them. Finally, we have diuretics, which decrease the blood volume, which causes a decrease in pressure because there's simply less blood that is able to exert a force. And all three of those drugs don't necessarily mess with muscle contraction or depolarization. So I'm going to take a brief pause to erase this. Oh, and all of that stuff relates back to Wigler's diagram. As I said, by slowing the weight of slowing the weight of the depolarization, this happens more slowly, thus decreasing the overall blood pressure because less pressure is being pumped over time, less blood is being pumped over time. Same thing as decreasing muscle contraction, the overall pressure of this peak would be lower. By decreasing muscle contraction, it would also take longer to build up to that point. By decreasing pressure, this would be lower, the aortic pressure, and thus the entire peak of this can be lower than it is in this depiction. Now moving on to essay prompt 3, talking about this man's medical history and how that affects his exercise. So first of all, because he just came out of surgery and he's just beginning exercise now, we're going to have a couple specific considerations. And that's just really simple ones, like always make sure he's supervised during exercise, make sure he has an emergency action plan, making sure that he has access to his emergency dilator whenever he is, whether he's working out or just doing activities of daily living. Now, as for the second part of the prompt, he will have a decreased exercise tolerance. That is because his heart is naturally pumping against a high blood pressure. Because it's pumping against the high blood pressure, it only has so much more that it can increase. The heart has a natural limit on how hard it can pump and how fast it can pump. And because it is at a resting rate, at a much higher point relative to that maximum, there's only so much room for improvement. I don't know if this drawing makes sense, but let's say, actually, I can do it like this. So because his heart is working at, let me So if this ball were to represent the total output of his heart through his total cardiac output, the top being 100%, at resting, a typical person would be much lower, and so they have much more room to go up towards that 100%. They can have a much more significant improvement over the resting. But because the man has high blood pressure, his cardiac output has to be, well, not necessarily his cardiac output, but his blood pressure would be closer to its natural maximum. Because of that, it has much less room to improve. And were it to go beyond this, it would cause damage, or his heart would be unable to even meet that output of of blood pressure. Sorry. Now, final part of the prompt. Well, like I said, he can do exercise. It just would be at a much lighter intensity because he has a lower exercise tolerance. However, he can eventually, over time, push that up towards a more moderate intensity were he to have supervision and, as I said, over time, increase that. Finally, cardiovascular effects of exercise. So we have a couple main things that happen during this. We have a increase in cardiac output and blood pressure. So, that was my notes. So, the increase in cardiac output and blood pressure is due to a couple reasons. For cardiac output, it's going to have an increase of venous return. So, the veins typically are a sink for blood. They hold a large amount of it. So, when exercise begins, they are going kind of drain that sink and pump blood towards the heart quicker, increasing venous return so that more blood can be pumped out of the heart. The next increase we are going to see is an increase in heart rate and an increase in contractility. So the increase of heart rate means that the equation for cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So this affects stroke volume. This is directly affecting heart rate. We're going to have an increase on the rate of the heart beats, and that allows more blood to be pumped out. Now this also, like, let me make sure it's actually showing me, yeah. This also, like venous return, contractility affects stroke volume by being able to have a lower a higher ejection fraction from the heart into the rest of the body, going to have more blood going into the rest of the body. That allows the body to perform work. That also leads to blood pressure. The increase in heart rate, not as much, but it does impact it. And the increase of venous return, along with contractility, also causes blood pressure to increase. However, that's not the only effects exercise has on the body. We also have a, how do I want to draw this? I'll just speak it. We have a reduction in the amount of blood going to organs, non-essential organs for that exercise. So less blood is going to go to the stomach, the spleen, the digestive system, But we are going to have an increase in blood going to the working muscles and the skin. So, as well as the brain, but it's a marginal increase, really. But we're going to have a major amount of increase in blood to the skin and into the working muscle. The blood that is going towards the skin, essentially the capillaries are going to dilate, so that more blood is going to go to them, and that allows for body heat to dissipate through the skin. That body heat is generated by the metabolic processes of doing work. So muscles contracting and just increased metabolic processes happening in the body. So also we're going to have an increase in blood flow to the working muscles. The working muscles need more blood to perform a higher amount of work so that they can have more oxygen and get rid of the metabolites quicker. This acts as a sink where most of the blood that's being pumped through the body is going through those working muscles. And to round off what I had mentioned before, the blood that is going towards the organs is going to be reduced by vasoconstricting those vessels going to them. This basically means that as blood goes through the path of least resistance, it's going to naturally flow greater towards those working muscles compared to the organs. Let me see here. And I believe that is it for all of them.